At 3 a.m., Linda Prescott, the 55-year-old president of the Pine Crest Meadows HOA, was ankle-deep in muddy water, screaming into her phone as her silver Lexus floated slowly into a neighbor's garden. Sirens wailed in the distance. Sprinklers fizzled and sparked. Fruit trees cracked under the force of the current. And all I could think was, I warned them. They had to dig that trench. They had to destroy my orchard. So I gave them exactly what they asked for, and a little more. You're probably wondering how it all came to this. Let me take you back a few months, back when the world was still green and peaceful. My backyard was my sanctuary. I'm Ben Holloway, 38, environmental engineer by trade and stubborn orchard keeper by passion. I live just beyond the border of Pine Crest Meadows, in a sliver of unincorporated land near Clearwater Hills. It's technically outside HOA control, which is something I used to take for granted. Not anymore. I built my home on a modest budget, nestled in a quiet pocket of land surrounded by cookie-cutter suburban perfection. And on that land, an orchard, pear trees, plums, figs, and one scrappy apple tree that never gave much but never stopped trying. That orchard wasn't just a hobby. It was healing. It was heritage. But apparently, to Linda Prescott, clipboard queen and self-declared savior of property values, it was a visual offense. She never introduced herself, but she loved slipping HOA newsletters into my mailbox. Technically illegal, but I let it slide. Until the rain came. That February was brutal. Record-breaking rainfall turned a corner of their subdivision into a swamp. Poor grading, terrible drainage design. Obvious stuff. But rather than fix their flawed infrastructure, the HOA, Linda and her enforcer, Gerald Jerry Marks from Lot 17, blamed me. Or rather, my orchard. Somehow, it was retaining excess groundwater. And in HOA speak, that translated to there's a puddle in Susan's backyard. I found out when a passive-aggressive email hit the neighborhood Google group. My address was in bold, all caps, non-compliant water flow source. I thought it was a joke until the trench showed up. One morning I stepped out with my coffee and saw a backhoe parked halfway on my property. Men in neon vests were digging a trench along the shared property line, cutting straight into my orchard. Roots were being sliced like deli meat. I yelled. They shrugged, said they were hired by the HOA to improve drainage. 2 plum trees were torn apart. A fig tree bent like it had been punched in the gut. The soil I'd nurtured for years looked like a battlefield. Furious, I stormed over to Linda's house, phone camera rolling. She answered the door in yoga pants and a silk robe, wine glass in hand. I asked, politely, why her contractors had trespassed and destroyed my trees. She gave me a smirk and said it was necessary maintenance. When I demanded to know when I'd given permission for a trench to run through my land, she laughed. Don't be so dramatic. It's just landscaping. Landscaping. You killed my figs, I said. They're just trees, she replied with a sip. That was the moment I knew. Linda Prescott had no soul. And this was going to get ugly. I tried the legal route. Documented everything. Called my insurance. Hired a lawyer. He was decent but dispassionate. Technically, he said, the trench was just outside the boundary of actionable damage. Suing would cost more than I'd get back. The HOA had a full legal team on retainer. Unless I wanted to spend 5 years in court arguing about root systems, I was out of luck. So I waited. Watched. And when the trench started to erode even more of my orchard during the next rain, I called someone else, Dr. Mason Reyes, a civil engineer with a love for maps and a taste for revenge by design. We walked the land with his laser level and a cooler of beer. What he discovered made me smile. Their system depended on me. My orchard had been absorbing their runoff for years. All I had to do was make sure it didn't. I built a covert French drain. Legal. Invisible. Ruthlessly effective. So when that spring storm came, when the skies opened up and their trench turned into a canal, I just watched. As Linda shouted into the night, ankle deep in the very flood she helped create, I stood on my porch, sipping coffee, and whispered to myself, you really should have left the orchard alone. But after realizing that taking the Pine Crest Meadows HOA to court over root encroachment would be a black hole of time and money, I accepted what my lawyer told me. You technically have a case, he mumbled, chewing into the phone. But they'll drown you in countersuits and HOA bylaws before you even get a hearing. Translation? I was out of luck. But Linda Prescott and her HOA weren't done with me. No, they doubled down. A week later, I started receiving official-looking notices accusing me of intentionally directing water into their neighborhood. According to them, my orchard's humble irrigation setup, which had peacefully existed for 5 years, was now a malicious water management system. Their words, malicious, as if I had built a Bond villain fortress with underground pumps flooding their flower beds for fun. They gave me 30 days to dismantle the so-called non-compliant structure. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. There was no structure, just a hose, a timer, and good old-fashioned gravity. Meanwhile, the trench they'd carved through my orchard sat exposed, unreinforced, and eager to cause chaos. During the next heavy rain, it did exactly that. Erosion worsened, soil washed away, and 5 of my trees began to show signs of stress. One of my favorite pear trees, the one that had bloomed like clockwork for years, collapsed entirely after a brutal spring downpour. That was when I showed up at the next HOA board meeting, ready to speak. But as soon as I walked in, Gerald Jerry Marks, their smug vice president, pointed at me and said, "This is a members-only meeting." Before I could say a word, Linda signaled her new favorite toy, security. Yes, actual security guards. They escorted me off the property like I was some kind of threat. All clipboards, whispers, and disdainful glares. And that was the moment something inside me broke. Not in the scream into the void kind of way. In the quiet, focused, surgical kind. The kind that says, okay, you want a flood? Let's make it rain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The final straw wasn't the trench. It wasn't the loss of my trees, or even the absurd accusation that I was waging ecological warfare via hosepipe. It was what I found one afternoon after a long day at work. A concrete drainage pipe. Not beside my fence. Through it. Someone had cut clean through my back fence, tunneled under the property line, and installed a pipe that ran straight into my orchard, sealed and finished like it had always belonged there. No note. No explanation. No permission. That night, I stood in the dark, flashlight in hand, just staring at it, humming to myself like a villain stepping into Act 2. Because that's how they saw me now, right? The problem. The threat. The barrier to their suburban utopia. They built a trench. They directed the water. But what would happen if the water changed direction? Physics, I remembered, has a beautiful sense of irony. I spent the next several days obsessively researching municipal drainage codes, soil composition, and liability law. Turns out, runoff is a legal gray zone, especially when it moves across improperly permitted land. The more I read, the more I realized just how deep Linda and her board had buried themselves. The pipe alone was a blatant easement violation, but proving that in court? I'd need a topographic survey, expert witnesses, and about $20,000 in patience. So I called my lawyer again, hoping maybe I'd missed something. "You've got a solid claim," he admitted. "But they'll stall you to death. You'll burn 10 grand just getting to discovery." I thanked him and hung up. Then I looked out my window, at the shattered remains of what used to be my best plum tree. It had been the first thing I planted when I built this house. I remembered tying little ribbons around its trunk to stop the rabbits from chewing the bark. Now, it looked like someone had blown it apart with dynamite. Still clinging to a shred of hope, I drafted a formal complaint. Photos, a timeline, repair estimates. I sent it all to the HOA. A few days later, I got a generic form letter signed by Linda. The Pinecrest Meadows HOA is committed to community excellence and will investigate this matter internally. I could hear her smirk through the paper. 2 days after that, a new notice was taped, yes, taped, to my front door. Like a teenager breaking up with you after prom. It accused me, again, of water mismanagement and warned of escalating action if I didn't comply. That's when I knew they wanted war. Management ordinances, and claimed that my property was now the likely source of flooding in adjacent parcels. Translation? They had destroyed my orchard, and now they were blaming me for the mess they created. That was when the real pettiness began. Pinecrest Meadows HOA members I had never even spoken to started glaring as they passed my house. One day, I found a handwritten note in my mailbox that read, "Selfish landowners like you are the reason property values are tanking." The neighbor who used to wave every morning? Now they turned their head like I'd grown horns. It was like I'd been cast as the villain in a community theater production I didn't audition for. All that was missing were the torches and pitchforks, and I had a strong suspicion Linda Prescott was passing those out at the next board meeting. And she wasn't finished. One morning, I was woken by the unmistakable screech of power tools. I pulled back the curtains and saw a full construction crew digging deeper into the trench along the property line. Only now, it was turning into a full-blown concrete drainage channel. No subtlety, no notice. Just rebar, concrete, and arrogant confidence. I stormed outside and confronted them. "You're on my land," I snapped. One of the workers shrugged, chewing on a donut. "We got permits. Talk to the HOA." When I marched down to Clearwater Hills City Hall to raise hell, I learned the real kicker. The permit? It listed the construction area as community common space. It wasn't. It was my land. But the application had been rubber-stamped by some clerk who clearly hadn't bothered to check the parcel map. Bureaucracy at its finest. I filed a formal dispute that same day, but I knew it would sit in a forgotten inbox for weeks. Meanwhile, my orchard, my sanctuary, was dying. Nearly half the trees were gone. The trench was accelerating soil erosion faster than I could stop it. Even the birds that used to greet the sunrise on my fig branches had moved on. It felt like I was watching years of love and labor be erased, one root, one tree, 1 inch of soil at a time. And I was expected to smile while they handed me the shovel. No, that was the moment I stopped waiting for help. I picked up the phone and called Dr. Mason Reyes, a friend from college and one of the best stormwater engineers I knew. Dry sense of humor, laser-precise thinking. He listened as I explained the trench, the damage, the bogus permits, and Linda Prescott's smug face. There was a pause. Then he said the most beautiful thing I'd heard in weeks. "If they're going to use gravity against you, there's no reason you can't return the favor." That weekend, Mason showed up with a topographic survey map, a laser level, and a cooler of beer. We spent hours walking the property, measuring angles, studying slope direction, mapping choke points. What we discovered was poetic. Their new drainage system only worked because my land was absorbing the overflow. Their trench was designed with the assumption that I would continue being their sponge. But if the water had nowhere to go, or worse, if it had a path back, that was the birth of Operation Reverse Flood. I didn't have to break a single law. I didn't even need a permit. I wasn't building a structure. I was improving my landscape. That's what the city paperwork would say. I started laying down compacted clay and gravel to seal off the topsoil. Planted hardy, deep-rooted shrubs along the boundary line, ones that subtly redirected water away from my property. And beneath it all, I installed a covert French drain system, buried deep, with just enough slope to guide the overflow right back to where it came from. Every pipe, every connection was laid by hand. Quietly, carefully, sometimes in the dead of night, with only a headlamp and the sound of distant crickets. No one suspected a thing. By the time I was done, their trench had unknowingly become the starting point of their own undoing. Because water flows downhill. Always. And now, it was heading home. The French drain I had installed ran downhill, quietly, efficiently, straight into the lowest points of Pine Crest Meadows. I spent 2 weeks working on it in secret, sometimes at night with just a headlamp and sheer spite to guide me. No one suspected a thing. The HOA assumed I was broken, that I'd retreat, replant my crushed orchard, and quietly fade into defeat like a good little homeowner. But I wasn't replanting. I was rearming. The beauty of it all. I didn't need to break a single law. I just had to let nature do what it always does, seek balance. Water flows downhill. Always. I simply made sure that, when the next big storm arrived, the water would flow back exactly the way it came. And when it hit, oh, it hit hard. But here's the kicker. Just 3 days before the storm, I received a certified letter from Linda Prescott. A final warning, she called it, demanding that I immediately cease all disruptive landscaping activities. The letter ended with one bolded, underlined sentence. "You are responsible for any damages caused by your actions." I read it. I laughed. I thought, oh, Linda, you have no idea what's coming. By then, the sky had started to shift, thick slate-gray clouds stretching across the horizon, the kind that make you instinctively check your weather app even though you already know what it means. A big one was coming. Not the kind of gentle spring rain that makes the grass happy, but the kind that relocates entire gardens. Every forecast read the same. Significant rainfall expected. Flash flooding likely in low-lying areas. I didn't rejoice because I wanted destruction. I'm not a monster. But for once, nature was about to serve justice on its own. And I didn't need to lift a single illegal finger. The stage was set. The players were in position. And the storm? It had impeccable timing. By that point, the Pinecrest Meadows HOA had fully completed their little concrete catastrophe, a trench lined with rebar and arrogance, snaking along the side of the neighborhood and dumping out into the corner of my now decimated orchard. My trees were gone, replaced by a muddy scar and a pipe that stuck out like a loaded weapon. Their system was overbuilt, underplanned, and, most importantly, vulnerable. It only worked under one assumption, that I would stay passive, that I'd keep being their sponge, absorbing their runoff like a dutiful buffer zone. They didn't realize nature has a sense of humor. And so do I. The rain began as a polite drizzle. It smelled like fresh earth and washed the air clean. By nightfall, it was a different beast, hammering down like 1,000 drums on a mission. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the first streams of water fill their trench. Faster than even I expected, it filled to the brim. The issue? That corner of the neighborhood was almost perfectly flat. No engineered slope. No secondary exit. So the water? It had nowhere to go. Except back. And my quiet little drainage system buried beneath the orchard? Oh, it was humming along beautifully, redirecting every gallon of HOA runoff right back into their pristine backyards. By midnight, their trench had become a canal. Water overflowed the edges, dragging mulch and mud into their neatly manicured flower beds. I spotted one poor guy's Adirondack chair drifting across his patio like a lonely pool float. Someone in a neon raincoat was waving a flashlight around, frantically pacing like they could negotiate with the storm. I almost felt bad. Almost. Around 1 a.m., I saw her, Linda Prescott, standing on her porch in a soggy bathrobe, phone in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other. Her hair clung to her face in wet clumps. She kept looking toward my property like she could will the water to stop out of sheer force of entitlement. I turned off my porch light. The show wasn't over yet. Then came the failure point. In their infinite HOA wisdom, they had installed a catch basin at the lowest point of their communal area. Just a glorified hole with a metal grate. It was supposed to collect overflow and redirect it. But it wasn't deep enough. Worse, the grate was already clogged with leaves, mulch, and decorative pine straw, courtesy of Linda's bi-weekly landscaping mandates. I watched from the shadows as the water rose. It reached the basin, swirled for a moment, then, with a quiet, almost respectful gurgle, spilled over, right into the main road. The current picked up, driveways disappeared, mulch became slurry, and Pinecrest Meadows was officially underwater. The water rose fast. Sidewalks vanished beneath swirling runoff. Driveways turned into miniature canals. A mailbox at the end of the street leaned at a strange angle, then gave up entirely, snapping off at the base with a pitiful thunk. At exactly 3 a.m., the sirens arrived. A fire truck, 2 police cruisers, and a city maintenance vehicle from Clearwater Hills. They rolled into the neighborhood like the cavalry. Unfortunately, just after the battle had already been lost. They parked at the front of Pinecrest Meadows, where the flooding hadn't yet consumed the roads. Their emergency lights cast eerie reflections on the shimmering lake that used to be the HOA's manicured cul-de-sac. From my porch, I could hear the static from their radios crackling like whispers of disbelief. Across the street, Linda Prescott was a vision of frantic chaos. Standing ankle-deep in cold brown water, she was screaming into her phone while her silver Lexus gently floated down the slope of her driveway like it was part of a luxury boat parade. I couldn't hear her words, but her body language said it all. Blame, rage, desperation. She looked around wildly, as if summoning a rescue with sheer entitlement. Maybe she was calling the city, or the fire department, or her lawyer, anyone who would listen. But no one could fix it now. The damage had been done, and it had all begun with the very drainage system she insisted on forcing through my land. Somewhere downstream, someone's garden gnome drifted by like a tiny, judgmental raft. It was surreal. When the sun finally crept up over the rooftops, the neighborhood looked like it had hosted a disaster-themed rodeo. Lawns were shredded. Mulch had formed strange, swirling piles in the streets. Basements were flooded, and the HOA's beloved walking trail, submerged under 6 inches of gritty, debris-laden runoff. The trench they'd built, the one that carved through my orchard, was now just a scar. Broken, overflowing, stagnant, and reeking. City engineers arrived later that morning, clipboards in hand, boots sloshing through what used to be Pine Crest Meadows' pride and joy. I played the role of concerned citizen perfectly, standing just far enough away not to draw suspicion, but close enough to hear every word. I poured coffee into a thermos and casually offered it to one of the city workers. He accepted it gratefully, took one look at the trench, and muttered, "Whose idea was this disaster?" I kept my expression neutral. I think it was a Pine Crest Meadows HOA initiative. Something about managing excess runoff from common areas. He nodded grimly. Well, it definitely ran off. By noon, chaos had fully bloomed. About a dozen homeowners had gathered outside Linda's house, waterlogged shoes squeaking, faces tight with anger. Some clutched insurance paperwork. Others waved cell phones like weapons. A few looked like they were barely holding back tears. Linda stood at her doorway, no longer in her designer robe. Instead, she wore a stiff navy blazer that she probably thought screamed authority, but now just made her look absurdly out of touch. Her perfectly curled hair was replaced by a frizzy halo of humidity and stress. I stayed on my porch, trimming the last branches of what used to be my best fig tree. I listened, because in Pine Crest Meadows, sound carries. Voices rose. Accusations flew. Why didn't you test the system? Who approved this? What do you mean insurance won't cover it? Someone threatened to sue. Another shouted for an emergency HOA meeting. Linda tried to keep control, raising her hands, calling for calm. No one was in the mood for calm. The community had turned on her. Her kingdom was sinking, and the peasants were sharpening pitchforks. That night, I opened the certified letter she'd sent me just days before. The one declaring I was liable for any damage. I reread it, smiled, then slid it into a folder labeled evidence, just in case. But honestly, I wasn't worried. I hadn't diverted anything. I hadn't touched the city infrastructure. All I'd done was adjust my own landscaping. If their trench couldn't handle water behaving like water, that sounded like a design flaw to me. The sweetest part? They didn't even know I was behind it. To them, it was just an unlucky mix of heavy rain and bad engineering. And maybe that's all it would ever be, on paper. But I knew. And that was enough. Well, almost enough. Because the next morning, I found a letter on my doorstep. No envelope. Just a single, neatly typed sheet of paper. It was from Linda, and it began with 5 words. We need to talk. Urgently. I stared at it on my kitchen counter, sipping lukewarm coffee, and wondering, what color panic is Linda Prescott's voice when it cracks? I wondered what kind of panic Linda Prescott's voice would carry when cracked. And when I finally decided to entertain her little white flag plea, we need to talk. Urgently. I found out. Those 5 words tasted like surrender with a hint of desperation. It was the HOA equivalent of waving a handkerchief from a sinking ship, typed, printed, and hand-delivered under the cover of soggy dawn. I wasn't exactly in a forgiving mood. But curiosity is a stubborn creature. Besides, I wanted to see how she was going to spin this disaster. It was the first time in months she wasn't holding all the cards. I strolled down to her house that afternoon, wearing the most casual clothes I owned. Mud-stained jeans, a wrinkled flannel, and my favorite straw hat, the one she once insulted as a little too farmercore. Her driveway was a war zone. The Lexus had been towed the night before, but the water line on her garage door left a brown stain high enough to serve as a flood memorial. Her front yard looked like compost had gone to battle with a leaf blower. A soggy Pine Crest Meadows HOA newsletter clung to the porch steps like a badge of shame. She opened the door looking like she hadn't slept in a year. Her hair was yanked back, her eyes dark and hollow. The stiff blazer was gone, replaced by a damp hoodie that read "Property Value Matters." I had to bite my cheek to keep from laughing. "Thank you for coming," she said, as if she were hosting brunch and not the aftermath of her own downfall. "I was in the neighborhood," I replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The living room was sterile, painfully beige. It smelled faintly of lemon-scented panic. She motioned to the couch. I didn't sit. She cut straight to it. "We need to discuss what happened. The flooding. The damage." "Oh, the flood," I said, pretending to be surprised. "Yes, that was quite the biblical event. Funny how water behaves when you force it through untested systems." Her jaw clenched. "We believe there was interference." "Interference?" I echoed. "From who?" She paused. That was the moment I saw it. She didn't have proof. Just suspicion. A creeping, paranoid certainty that I had orchestrated the whole thing. But no evidence. Nothing she could take to court without sounding unhinged. I know what you did, she said finally, her voice low and brittle. I smiled. And yet, here I am. Not arrested. Not sued. Just a humble landowner, with some very wet, very damaged trees. She stared at me, clearly trying to take control of the conversation again. This is a crisis. Dozens of homes were affected. Insurance claims are being denied. The board is in chaos. I shrugged. Sounds like poor planning. Maybe the person responsible should be held accountable. That one hit. Her face faltered. There's talk of a special election, she said quietly. I might be removed as president. Tragic, I replied, deadpan. She dropped the act and leaned forward. Look, this doesn't help anyone. You've made your point, all right? The trench. The pipe. We went too far. But now the entire neighborhood is suffering. And we're all neighbors, aren't we? The woman who trespassed on my land, killed my trees, and tried to bury me in bureaucratic red tape was now trying to sell me on unity. Like we were co-stars in a community sitcom instead of adversaries in a slow-burning war. You want something, I said flatly. What is it? She hesitated. Calculating. We need help. The city's issued a violation notice. They're demanding immediate corrections to the drainage system or we face fines. We need access to your land to reroute the trench. Your cooperation would help ease tensions. I looked at her for a long moment. She wanted me to bail her out. Not out of remorse. Not because she'd changed. But because, for once, the consequences had reached her doorstep, both literally and figuratively. I'll think about it, I said, turning to leave. That's it, she called after me. I paused, looked over my shoulder. You know, Linda, you really should have left the orchard alone. Back home, I opened my laptop and started uploading everything: photos, videos, HOA letters, timestamped chaos. I dropped it all into a folder I'd already titled HO Apocalypton. I didn't expect it would go this far. But Linda's grip on power was slipping faster than water through a cracked culvert. And Pinecrest Meadows was just beginning to unravel. In the days that followed the flood, Pinecrest Meadows fell into open rebellion. A group of residents formally filed motions to dissolve the current HOA board. One bold homeowner spray-painted Drain Queen across Linda Prescott's garage door in fire engine red. Another emailed the entire neighborhood a copy of the original trench plans, along with a scathing breakdown of how the board ignored multiple engineering warnings. That's when the insurance company stepped in, denying claims across the board, citing gross negligence. It only added fuel to the mutiny. Linda tried to call for an emergency meeting, but barely anyone showed. One by one, board members began to resign. Jerry Marks was the first to go, citing stress-related health concerns. Others followed quickly, their titles disappearing like sandbags in a flood. Linda clung to her presidency as long as she could, white-knuckled and defiant, like she believed her signature on a letterhead might stop the water from rising. But even she eventually cracked. Her resignation letter was terse, defensive, riddled with legalese, but it ended with the sentence everyone had been waiting for. Effective immediately, I resign as president of the Pinecrest Meadows Homeowners Association. I printed it, framed it, and hung it in my tool shed next to a wooden plaque that read, "Don't start none, won't be none." The aftermath? Messy, but satisfying. The HO was forced to hire an independent contractor to fully redesign the drainage system. This time, they needed real permits, actual surveys, and city oversight. Every cent came from their emergency fund, which promptly ran dry. Dues were doubled. Residents were livid. Linda quietly sold her house a few months later. Word was she moved to a gated community across town. I wished them luck. As for me, I replanted. Not because I forgave. Not because I forgot. But because the land deserved it. I brought in fresh soil, replaced the fallen trees, and even installed a greenhouse, ironically paid for with the settlement check I squeezed out of the city once they admitted their oversight in approving the trench permits. The orchard returned, stronger than before. The birds came back. So did the bees. One afternoon, while picking the first batch of pears, a neighborhood kid biked by and yelled, "Hey, you're the guy who flooded the HOA, right?" I smiled. I prefer neighborhood hydrologist, but sure. Nature finds balance. So does karma. And sometimes, it even brings pears. Pear.